One envelope changed everything. In court, the DNA test results were revealed, and what they believed their entire lives turned out to be a lie. Brother and sister. Not anymore. What do you think this story is hiding? Comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. The best is yet to come. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs, a mixture of impatience and curiosity. The benches were lined with faces, some indifferent, others keenly watching the two young figures seated near the front. A boy, around 10 years old, sat with his arms crossed, his dark eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Beside him, a girl of the same age clutched the edge of her chair, her knuckles pale against her deep brown skin. Her gaze was fixed on the floor, as though willing herself invisible. They were dressed simply, his shirt slightly too big, her dress neatly pressed but showing signs of wear. Despite their small stature, they held themselves with a quiet defiance, as if the weight of the room's judgment couldn't crush the bond between them. The case was routine, at least on paper. The boy and girl had been called as witnesses to provide testimony regarding an incident in their neighborhood. Their presence was a mere formality, the final step in a drawn-out process. They had been reassured beforehand, it was nothing serious, just a chance to tell their side of the story. Yet, as they sat under the cold fluorescent lights of the courtroom, the air felt heavy with something more than legal proceedings. The judge, a gray-haired man with a severe expression, adjusted his glasses and looked at the documents before him. His voice, calm but firm, echoed across the room. "Before we proceed with the testimony, there's an issue we need to address," he said, pausing to scan the children. "It has been brought to the court's attention that the familial relationship between these two witnesses has not been formally verified." The boy's head shot up, confusion clouding his face. The girl blinked rapidly, her hands tightening their grip on the chair. "They are siblings," the social worker sitting nearby interjected, her tone defensive. "They've lived as brother and sister for as long as anyone can remember." The judge raised a hand, silencing her. "Be that as it may, the court requires certainty in all matters of testimony. A DNA test will be conducted to confirm their relationship before their statements are taken into record." A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. The boy frowned, leaning closer to the girl. "What does he mean? Why do they need that?" he whispered. "I don't know," she replied softly, her voice barely audible. The judge's gavel struck wood, restoring silence. "This is not up for debate. The test will ensure there is no question of bias or misrepresentation." His words were devoid of malice, yet their implications landed heavily on the children's shoulders. The boy straightened, his jaw tightening. "We don't need a test," he muttered to no one in particular. "She's my sister." The girl glanced at him, her lips trembling into a faint, reassuring smile. "It's okay," she said, her voice steadier than her expression. "Let's just do it. It's just a test. It doesn't change anything." But as the social worker ushered them out of the courtroom to begin the process, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something neither of them could control. Back in the courtroom, the whispers resumed. The judge sat back, unreadable, as if what he had just set in motion was no more than another procedural step. The truth, however, was far more complicated. Neither the boy nor the girl could have known that the sterile precision of a DNA test would unravel the very foundation of the life they had built together. The boy and girl had known each other for as long as they could remember. Their earliest memories were like fragmented photographs, playing in the yard of their small, run-down house, sharing a single blanket on cold nights, and whispering secrets to each other as the world outside raged with indifference. They had no clear recollection of how they came to live together. They only knew the warmth of each other's presence. "You're my brother," the girl had said once, with a certainty that allowed no room for doubt. "And you're my sister," he had replied, sealing their unspoken pact with a grin that could brighten the gloomiest day. Their home was modest, barely more than a shack on the edge of a crumbling neighborhood. The paint peeled off the walls, the windows rattled in the wind, and the roof leaked whenever it rained. But to them, it was a fortress. Inside those walls, they were safe, protected from the world that seemed intent on reminding them of their place at the bottom. Their guardian, a weary woman with lines etched deep into her face, rarely spoke of their past. When asked about their parents, she would shrug and say something vague, "They're not here anymore. You've got each other, and that's enough." It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the only one they had, so they accepted it. Growing up in poverty was hard enough, but being black children in a predominantly white, hostile neighborhood made it even harder. They faced constant prejudice, from whispered insults to outright threats. At school, their classmates sneered, calling them names that stung like whips. Teachers turned a blind eye, or worse, blamed them for the trouble. But no matter how cruel the world became, they had each other. The boy, always protective, would shield his sister from the worst of it. When kids at school would shove her or mock her clothes, he'd step in, fists clenched, daring anyone to challenge him. "You don't touch my sister," he would say, his voice steady and cold. The girl, in turn, became his comfort. On nights when he came home with bruises he wouldn't explain, she would sit beside him, holding his hand until he fell asleep. "It's okay," she would whisper. "We'll get out of here one day. Just you and me." Despite everything, they found moments of joy. They'd race each other down the street barefoot, the cracked pavement no match for their laughter. On lazy afternoons, they'd sit under the lone tree in their yard, sharing dreams of a better life. The boy wanted to be a firefighter, the girl, a teacher. In their imaginations, they built a future far away from the decay and hatred that surrounded them. Their bond was unbreakable. Every hardship they faced only strengthened their belief that they were meant to stand side by side. When one of them fell, the other lifted them up. When the world grew too heavy, they shared the weight. "We're family," they'd remind each other, a mantra that became their shield against the darkness. Yet, beneath their shared certainty, there were cracks, small, unspoken doubts that neither dared to voice. The boy sometimes wondered why he didn't look like his sister, why their features were so different. The girl occasionally questioned why their guardian avoided their questions about the past. But those thoughts were fleeting, quickly dismissed. What mattered was the present. And in the present, they were brother and sister. That was the truth they clung to, the foundation of their lives. What they couldn't have known was that this foundation, built on a decade of shared struggles and love, was about to be shaken to its core. The truth, long buried, was waiting to surface, and when it did, it would leave their world unrecognizable. The courtroom, once loud with murmurs and rustling papers, had fallen into an uneasy silence. The boy and girl sat together on a wooden bench near the back, their small figures dwarfed by the imposing room. The cold air seemed to press down on them, heavy with judgment and tension. The judge had called for a recess, and the DNA test was being prepared. The boy fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, a nervous habit he had picked up when he was younger. The girl sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her wide eyes betrayed her anxiety. "It's nothing," the boy muttered under his breath, more to himself than to her. "They just want to be sure. It doesn't mean anything." The girl nodded, but her lips remained pressed tightly together. She glanced around the room, taking in the watchful eyes of the strangers seated nearby. The whispers had stopped, but she could still feel the weight of their curiosity and, in some cases, outright disdain. One woman, seated a few rows away, leaned toward her companion and whispered something. The girl caught the words, "waste of time," and "those people." She felt the familiar sting of humiliation but said nothing. Instead, she turned to her brother, who was glaring at the same woman with a defiant fire in his eyes. "Don't," she said softly. "It's not worth it." He sighed, leaning back against the bench. "I hate this place. I hate all of them." The girl reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold but steady. "We're family," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. "That's all that matters." The boy looked at her, his expression softening. "Yeah," he said, squeezing her hand. "We're family." The social worker, seated nearby, cleared her throat and gave them an encouraging smile. "It won't take long," she said, though her tone betrayed her uncertainty. "Just a formality, really. You've got nothing to worry about." But the boy and girl weren't so sure. The sterile, impersonal atmosphere of the courtroom made everything feel larger and more threatening than it was. The towering shelves of legal books, the polished wood of the judge's bench, the impassive faces of the clerks, it all seemed to whisper that something was out of their control. The test itself was simple. A technician, dressed in a crisp white coat, called them to a small side room. The boy went first, sitting stiffly as the technician swabbed the inside of his cheek. He glanced at his sister, who stood watching nervously, and gave her a reassuring nod. "See? Nothing to it," he said as he hopped off the chair. The girl's turn was just as quick, though she flinched slightly at the sensation of the swab. When it was over, the technician placed the samples into labeled containers and disappeared down the hall without another word. As they walked back into the courtroom, the boy turned to his sister. "Told you it was no big deal," he said, attempting a grin. But the girl didn't respond. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her brow furrowed in thought. Back in their seats, the minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. The boy drummed his fingers against the bench, his restlessness growing. "How long does this take?" he muttered. "Long enough," the girl replied quietly. Around them, the courtroom began to fill with the noise of people returning from the recess. Lawyers shuffled papers, spectators resumed their seats, and the judge re-entered, his robe flowing behind him like a shadow. The boy straightened, glancing at his sister. "No matter what, you know it doesn't change anything, right?" he said. She nodded slowly. "I know. We're family." "Yeah," he said, his voice firm. "We're family." But as the gavel struck the bench to call the court back to order, a strange unease settled over both of them. It was a small, creeping feeling, like the first hint of a storm on the horizon. Neither of them could have known just how much that storm would change their lives. For now, all they could do was wait, and cling to the one truth they believed could never be shaken. The courtroom, though quiet, felt suffocating. The boy and girl sat side by side on the same bench, but an invisible chasm had begun to form between them. The minutes stretched into an hour, and the tension, which had been simmering since the judge's unexpected announcement, now threatened to boil over. The boy sat hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw was set, his dark eyes fixed on the floor as if he could burn a hole through it. The girl, on the other hand, sat upright, her back rigid, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She kept stealing glances at him, hoping he would meet her gaze, but he didn't. "This is stupid," the boy muttered suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low and tight, barely masking the anger bubbling beneath. The girl flinched at the sharpness of his tone. "What is?" she asked cautiously. "All of it," he snapped, gesturing vaguely around the room. "The judge, the test, the questions. They're treating us like we don't even know who we are. Like we're liars or something." The girl bit her lip, unsure of how to respond. She wanted to agree with him, to tell him she felt the same anger, but instead, doubt crept into her voice. Maybe they just need to be sure. Maybe it's just a rule." He turned to her then, his eyes narrowing. "A rule? You really believe that? They don't care about rules, they care about making us feel small. That's what they've always done." She looked away, his words hitting a nerve she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "It's not about that," she murmured, though even she wasn't sure she believed it. The boy leaned back against the bench, shaking his head in frustration. "You always try to make excuses for them. Why? They don't deserve it. None of them care about us. His words stung, and she felt her throat tighten. I'm not making excuses, she said softly. I'm just trying to. I don't know. I don't want to make it worse. Worse, he repeated, his voice rising slightly. How could it be worse? They're already treating us like we're nothing. Like we're not even worth believing until some stupid test says so. The girl's hands stilled in her lap, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, almost in a whisper, she asked, do you think, maybe they're right to question us? The boy froze, his head snapping toward her. What? She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the floor. I mean, maybe I'm not a good enough sister. Maybe I've done something to make them think we're not. Her voice trailed off, and she swallowed hard. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, he said, his tone flat but laced with disbelief. You think this is your fault? How? What did you do, huh? Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, refusing to cry in front of him. I don't know, she whispered. But if they don't believe us, maybe it's because I haven't been enough. The boy stood up abruptly, pacing a few steps away before turning back to face her. Stop saying that. You didn't do anything wrong. They're the ones who are messed up, not you. But what if? No, he interrupted, his voice sharp. Don't let them get in your head. You're my sister. You've always been my sister. That doesn't change just because some judge or some stupid piece of paper says otherwise. The girl finally looked up at him, her face a mixture of hope and despair. Do you really believe that? Of course I do, he said, though the anger in his voice betrayed his own doubts. He sat back down beside her, but this time there was a noticeable distance between them. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. The boy stared straight ahead, his fists clenching and unclenching as he replayed the events of the day in his mind. The girl kept her gaze lowered, her thoughts spiraling into an abyss of self-doubt. For the first time, the bond that had always held them together felt fragile, as if the weight of the world around them was finally starting to crack it. And though neither of them wanted to admit it, the waiting, the not knowing, was pulling them further apart. In the stillness of the courtroom, their silence spoke louder than any word. The courtroom was alive with murmurs, voices that ebbed and flowed like waves of disdain. The boy and girl sat at their bench, shrinking under the weight of every glance, every whispered remark. The heavy air, thick with unspoken prejudice, now began to echo with the sharp edges of overt cruelty. It started subtly. A woman seated behind the attorneys leaned toward her neighbor, her voice just loud enough to carry. It's always the same story with them, isn't it? No fathers around, no mothers to speak of. And we're supposed to trust their testimony? The boy stiffened. His hands curled into fists on his knees, his knuckles white. He wanted to turn around, to glare at the woman, but the girl placed a trembling hand on his arm, silently pleading with him not to react. I mean, look at them, the man beside the woman added, his tone dripping with condescension. Poor kids, sure. But how do you expect them to even know who they really are? Probably never had a stable day in their lives. The words hit the girl like a blow to the chest. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the bench, her nails digging into the wood as she struggled to keep her composure. She could feel the boy beside her trembling with rage, his breath coming faster. Let it go, she whispered, barely audible. How can I? He hissed back, his voice low and furious. The judge, seated high above, seemed oblivious, or perhaps indifferent. His eyes scanned papers, his gavel resting idly beside him. Around the room, attorneys shuffled notes and spectators leaned in closer, feeding off the rising tension. One of the lawyers, a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper tongue, stood to address the court. His voice was cold, calculated. Your Honor, I must question the reliability of the testimony we are about to hear. These children, if we can even call them siblings, come from circumstances that are, to put it delicately, less than ideal. A ripple of laughter coursed through the room, subtle but cruel. The boy's fists clenched tighter, and the girl bit her lip so hard it almost bled. "They've been tossed around by the system," the attorney continued, gesturing vaguely toward the children. "Their upbringing is a patchwork of neglect and, let's be honest, questionable influences. Can we truly rely on their version of events when they don't even know their own origins?" The girl felt her stomach drop. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She wanted to scream that they weren't liars, that they weren't broken, but her voice felt trapped, smothered by the weight of the attorney's words. The boy, however, couldn't hold back. "That's not true," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Heads turned toward him, the sudden outburst slicing through the tense atmosphere. "Order," the judge barked, striking his gavel. "Young man, you will remain silent unless addressed." The boy sank back into his seat, seething but silent. The girl placed a hand on his arm again, her touch a mixture of comfort and desperation. As the attorney continued, the cruelty only deepened. He dissected their lives as if they were exhibits in a case study, pointing out every flaw, every struggle, and turning them into weapons. "These children are a product of chaos," he said, his voice smooth but venomous. "They've grown up in a world where rules don't apply, where survival takes precedence over truth. And now we're supposed to believe they can provide reliable testimony? Forgive me, Your Honor, but I find that difficult to accept." The boy's vision blurred with unshed tears, but he refused to let them fall. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The girl, trembling beside him, gripped his hand tightly, as if holding onto him was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. From the back of the courtroom, another voice chimed in, this one from a spectator who seemed to relish the attention. "What do you expect? Look at where they come from. It's no wonder they're in court already. Start young, I guess." Laughter followed, cruel and sharp. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could disappear. Every word felt like a dagger, cutting into her fragile sense of self-worth. She had spent her entire life trying to rise above the whispers, the stares, the judgments, and now it felt like they were drowning her. The boy leaned closer to her, his voice a fierce whisper. "Don't listen to them. They don't know us." But she couldn't help it. The words were in her ears, her head, her heart. Each insult, each assumption about who they were, chipped away at the identity they had built together. When the court adjourned for another recess, the boy stood abruptly, pulling the girl to her feet. "We don't need to stay here," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "We have to," she said quietly, her eyes downcast. He looked at her, his frustration mounting. "Why? So they can keep tearing us apart? So they can treat us like this?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because deep down, she was starting to wonder if the courtroom wasn't just a reflection of the truth the world had always tried to show them, that no matter how hard they fought, they would always be seen as less than. As they left the room, the echoes of laughter and judgment followed them, a haunting reminder that their battle was far from over. The courtroom fell silent as the judge returned to his seat, the sound of his gavel echoing through the room. The boy and girl sat side by side, their small frames rigid with tension. They had been holding hands tightly moments ago, but now their fingers had slipped apart, the weight of uncertainty too much to bear. A clerk approached the bench with a plain manila envelope, the kind that could contain anything, mundane paperwork or, as in this case, something that could destroy lives. The judge took it with practiced indifference, but the children could feel the gravity of the moment. The envelope might as well have been a weapon, poised to strike. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge began, adjusting his glasses and opening the envelope with deliberate slowness, "we now have the results of the DNA test requested earlier today." The boy straightened in his seat, his fists clenched on his knees. The girl stared at the judge, her lips parted, her breath shallow and quick. "It doesn't matter," the boy whispered, his voice low but firm. We know the truth. We're family. The girl nodded faintly but didn't speak. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The judge unfolded the papers, his expression neutral as he scanned the results. Finally, he looked up, his voice cool and clinical. The DNA test concludes that the two individuals in question share no biological relationship. They are not siblings. For a moment, the words hung in the air, incomprehensible, as if spoken in a language neither of them understood. The girl blinked, her mouth opening slightly, but no sound came out. The boy was the first to react. "What?" he said sharply, his voice rising above the murmurs that were starting to ripple through the room. "That's not true. That can't be true." The judge raised a hand for silence. "These results are conclusive," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "The court acknowledges that the individuals have no familial ties." The girl's shoulders began to shake as silent tears streamed down her face. She turned to the boy, her eyes wide with desperation. "What does this mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It doesn't mean anything," he snapped, his voice trembling with anger. "They're wrong. That stupid test is wrong." The social worker leaned forward, trying to calm him. "Sometimes these things happen," she said gently. "It doesn't change how you've grown up together." "Doesn't change," he shot back, glaring at her. "They're saying we're not family. How does that not change everything?" The girl sobbed openly now, burying her face in her hands. The boy's heart ached at the sight of her, but his own emotions were too raw to offer her the comfort she needed. The judge, unmoved by the scene unfolding before him, continued. "This result does not invalidate the bond you may feel. However, for legal purposes, this court will proceed with the understanding that the individuals are not biologically related." The boy stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We don't need your papers or your tests," he shouted. "She's my sister. She's always been my sister." "Sit down, young man," the judge ordered, his voice stern. The boy's chest heaved as he looked around the courtroom, his gaze darting between the judge, the attorneys, and the faces of the spectators. Each one seemed to be judging him, dissecting his pain, turning it into another spectacle. He felt trapped, cornered by a truth he refused to accept. He turned back to the girl, his voice softening as he crouched beside her. "Don't listen to them," he said, his hands gripping hers. "You're my sister. You'll always be my sister." She looked at him through her tears, her face crumpling. "But what if they're right?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "They're not," he insisted, though his own voice wavered. "They don't know us. They don't know anything about us." Around them, the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a wave of whispers and judgment. The boy wanted to scream at them all to stop, to leave them alone, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. The judge banged his gavel again, silencing the room. "The court acknowledges the difficulty of this situation," he said, though his tone lacked any real sympathy. "We will reconvene shortly." With that, the session was adjourned, and the children were left to sit in the deafening silence of their shattered reality. As they were escorted out of the courtroom, the boy and girl walked side by side, their connection frayed but not yet broken. The boy's mind raced with anger and denial, while the girl's thoughts were consumed by a single question: if they weren't family, then what were they? Neither of them had an answer, and for the first time in their lives, they felt truly alone. The social worker sat across from the boy and girl in a quiet, windowless room adjacent to the courtroom. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, filling the heavy silence as the children sat still, stunned by the weight of what they'd just heard. The woman looked at them with a mixture of compassion and unease, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I think it's time," she began gently, "that you both knew the truth about how you came to be together." The boy glared at her, his fists balled at his sides. "We already know the truth," he snapped. "She's my sister. The girl, still clutching a tissue damp with tears, looked up at the social worker, her voice trembling. But, if the test is right, then why did they tell us we were family? The social worker took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging under the weight of what she was about to say. When you were brought into the system, neither of you had much information about where you came from. You were very young, just toddlers, and neither of you had anyone to advocate for you. The boy frowned. What about our parents? The social worker hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. Your parents weren't in a position to care for you. Your mother, in both cases, had difficulties. Addiction, homelessness, instability. And your fathers, they were either absent or unknown. The girl's lip quivered. So they just left us? It's not as simple as that, the social worker said carefully. The system did what it could to place you both in homes, but, well, resources were limited, and mistakes were made. The boy shot up from his chair, pacing angrily across the small room. Mistakes? That's what you call it? You told us we were family. You made us believe that for 10 years. The social worker's voice softened. When you were placed together, it was meant to give you both stability. You had already bonded during your time in foster care. Bonded? The boy interrupted, his voice cracking with anger. We thought we were blood. We thought we had something real. You do have something real, the woman insisted. Family isn't always about biology. The boy shook his head, his frustration mounting. You don't get it. You don't understand what it's like to grow up thinking you have someone, only to find out it was all a lie. The girl, still seated, looked down at her hands. Why didn't you tell us? She asked softly. The social worker sighed. When you were young, it seemed kinder to let you believe you were siblings. You were so close, and it gave you both something to hold on to. The truth might have been too hard for you to handle then. The girl wiped her tears. And now? Now, the woman said, her tone firm but kind, you're old enough to understand that the bond you share is just as important as any biological tie. You've supported each other, protected each other, through so much. That's what family really means. The boy scoffed, his anger still simmering. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to live with this. The social worker nodded, acknowledging his pain. You're right. I can't imagine what this feels like. But I do know that the system failed you both in ways it shouldn't have. And for that, I'm truly sorry. The girl finally stood, her legs shaky beneath her. So, what now? What are we supposed to do? The social worker hesitated again, then said, that's up to you. You can choose to let this change how you see each other, or you can choose to focus on what you've built together over the years. No one can take that away from you. The boy stopped pacing and looked at the girl, his face a mix of anger, confusion, and hurt. What do you think? He asked, his voice quieter now. The girl hesitated, her tears threatening to spill again. I don't know, she admitted. I just feel empty. The social worker reached out to place a hand on the table between them. You're not alone in this, she said gently. And remember, no matter how you started, the love and care you've given each other is real. No test can change that. The boy and girl exchanged a long, uncertain look. Their world had been shaken, their past rewritten, but in the silence that followed, a small, unspoken agreement passed between them. The bond they had wasn't just something that could be erased by a piece of paper. Still, as they left the room, the weight of the system's failures clung to them like a shadow, a reminder that their childhood had been shaped not by choice, but by a machine that had stolen their past and handed them a fractured version of family. The only question now was whether they could rebuild what had been broken. The courthouse was behind them, but the weight of its revelations followed the boy and girl like an oppressive shadow. The social worker's words, the judge's cold pronouncement, and the undeniable truth of the DNA results swirled in their minds. What had once been the foundation of their lives, their identity as brother and sister, now felt like a fragile facade, shattered beyond repair. The girl walked a few steps behind the boy as they made their way down the sidewalk. Her head was bowed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if trying to hold herself together. She hadn't spoken since they left the courthouse. Her usually bright eyes were dull, clouded by a storm of confusion and sadness. She felt untethered, like a ship lost at sea without an anchor. If she wasn't his sister, then who was she? The thought repeated endlessly in her mind, each time leaving her more disoriented. For 10 years, she had known her place in the world, however small and battered it might have been. She was his sister, and he was her brother. That truth had been her shield against the harshness of their reality. Now, she wasn't sure she had any truth left. Ahead of her, the boy walked with long, determined strides, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His shoulders were hunched, his head down, but his body radiated tension. Every step felt like he was trying to outrun the words he had heard in court, but no matter how far he went, they stayed with him, echoing in his head. "They're not siblings." He hated those words. He hated the judge for saying them, the social worker for delivering them, and most of all, himself for feeling the crack in his bond with the girl he had sworn to protect. "She's not my sister," he muttered under his breath, the words tasting bitter and wrong. "She's not my sister." But no matter how many times he repeated it, he couldn't make himself believe it. The memories of their shared childhood flooded his mind, their games, their whispered secrets, their promises to always stick together. How could something as cold and sterile as a DNA test erase all of that? And yet, the bond between them now felt fragile. Like it could break with the slightest touch. The girl finally stopped walking, unable to take another step. She sank onto a bench by the side of the road, her legs trembling beneath her. The boy noticed after a moment and turned back, his brow furrowed with frustration. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. She looked up at him, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I don't know who I am anymore," she whispered. The boy frowned. "What are you talking about? You're you." She shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. "No, I'm not. I was your sister. That's who I was. And now? I don't know. If I'm not your sister, then what am I? What's left of me?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he didn't know how to respond. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she was still the same person she had always been, but the truth was, he didn't know who he was anymore either. "You don't need to be anything," he said finally, his voice quieter. You're still you." "But who is that?" she pressed, her voice rising with desperation. "Who am I without you?" The boy flinched, taking a step back. "Don't say that," he said, shaking his head. "You don't need me to be who you are." She stood then, her small frame trembling but her voice steady. "But I do. You've always been my brother. You're the only family I've ever had. And now they're telling me that was never real. So what am I supposed to do with that?" The boy opened his mouth to reply but found he had no words. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice rough. "I don't know what we're supposed to do." For the first time in their lives, they stood apart, unable to bridge the gap between them. The boy felt like he was failing her, and the girl felt like she was losing herself. The world around them carried on, indifferent to their pain. Cars honked, people passed by without a glance, and the sun sank lower in the sky. But for the boy and girl, everything felt frozen in place, as if time itself had stopped to mock them. Finally, the boy turned to her, his eyes dark with guilt and sadness. "I need some time," he said softly. I need to figure this out." The girl's face crumpled, but she nodded. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And with that, he walked away, leaving her alone on the bench. She watched him go, her heart breaking with every step he took. For the first time, she felt truly alone, as if the one person who had always been her anchor was now adrift as well. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the girl sat in silence, her identity unraveling piece by piece. And somewhere in the distance, the boy kept walking, trying to outrun the pain that had consumed them both. When the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was heavy, not with justice but with a brewing storm of prejudice. The boy and girl sat at their bench, their small bodies rigid, their hands clenched in their laps. The DNA results, cold and clinical, now loomed over them like a weapon, one that the courtroom seemed all too eager to wield. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I must address the matter of the DNA test results." His voice was calm, detached, as though he were discussing a routine matter rather than the identities of two vulnerable children. The boy glanced at the girl. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together. He could see the tears she was holding back, and it fueled his anger. He wanted to stand up, to shout that none of this mattered, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. One of the attorneys, a sharp-suited man with a slick-back haircut, stood to speak. His tone was measured, but there was a thinly veiled condescension in his words. "Your Honor, while the court acknowledges the difficult circumstances these children have endured, the results of the DNA test raise significant questions about their reliability as witnesses." The boy's head snapped up. "What does that have to do with anything?" he blurted out, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Order," the judge barked, slamming his gavel. "You will not speak out of turn." The boy sat back, fuming, but the damage was done. The attorney turned to him with a patronizing smile. "You see, Your Honor, the boy's emotional outburst is precisely why we must tread carefully here. These children have clearly been through a lot, and their perception of events may be clouded." "Clouded?" the girl whispered, her voice trembling. The attorney pressed on, ignoring her. "Moreover, their background, unstable upbringing, lack of consistent parental figures, raises concerns about their ability to provide credible testimony. And now, with the DNA results confirming they are not biologically related, we must question whether they have been conditioned to believe a narrative that may not align with the truth." The boy's fists tightened. He wanted to yell, to tell the attorney he didn't know anything about them, but the girl placed a trembling hand on his arm, silently begging him to stay quiet. The judge nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. "Proceed," he said. Another voice chimed in, this time from the opposing attorney. A woman with a firm, commanding presence stood, but her words offered little comfort. "While we cannot ignore the difficult realities these children have faced, we must also consider the implications of their upbringing. Growing up in an environment of systemic neglect and certain cultural disadvantages may have influenced their perceptions." The word cultural hung in the air, its true meaning unspoken but unmistakable. The boy felt his blood boil. He didn't need anyone to spell it out for him. "They're saying we're liars because we're black," he muttered under his breath. The girl squeezed his arm harder, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please don't," she whispered. The attorneys continued, their words cutting deeper with each passing moment. They dissected the children's lives as if they were case studies, not people. Their poverty, their skin color, their lack of a traditional family, all became evidence against them, a way to strip away their humanity and discredit their voices. "It is not about race," one attorney argued, though the boy could hear the lie in his tone. "It is about credibility. These children, through no fault of their own, have lived in circumstances that may compromise their ability to provide objective accounts." The judge nodded again, as if this reasoning were perfectly valid. "The court will take these factors into consideration." The girl finally broke. "We're telling the truth," she said, her voice small but desperate. "Why won't anyone believe us?" The judge looked at her with something that might have been pity but felt more like disdain. "Young lady, this is not about belief. It is about facts. And the facts suggest that your testimony must be approached with caution. The girl's shoulders sagged, and the boy felt a surge of helplessness he had never known before. He had spent his entire life protecting her, shielding her from the worst of the world's cruelty, but now he couldn't do anything. They were being stripped of their voices, their dignity, their very right to exist as they had always known themselves. The courtroom murmured with quiet approval, the spectators nodding along as if this dismantling of two children's lives was nothing more than routine justice. As the session dragged on, the boy and girl sat in silence, their heads bowed. The boy's anger simmered, but it was now mixed with something darker, the realization that no matter how loudly they shouted, no one in this room would hear them. By the time the gavel struck again to adjourn the court, the boy and girl felt like shadows of themselves. They had entered the courtroom with their identities intact, but now, as they walked out, they carried the weight of a system that had stolen their voices, their truths, and their very right to be believed. The courthouse doors closed behind them with a heavy thud, the sound reverberating through the boy and girl as if signaling the end of a chapter they never wanted to read. Outside, the sky was overcast, the sun hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The chill in the air matched the weight in their chests. They walked in silence down the courthouse steps, their footsteps echoing faintly on the concrete. The boy kept his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his jaw clenched, while the girl trailed slightly behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The weight of everything that had been said, the humiliation, the disbelief, and the crushing revelations about their lives pressed down on them like a physical force. When they reached the edge of the parking lot, the boy stopped abruptly, turning to face the girl. His dark eyes, usually filled with determination and defiance, now held only pain. "We need to talk," he said, his voice rough and low. The girl nodded, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Okay." They found a bench nearby, one they had sat on many times before while waiting for buses or just trying to escape the chaos of their lives. This time, it felt different, like it was the only stable thing left in a world that had crumbled around them. The boy sat first, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. The girl hesitated for a moment before sitting beside him, leaving a small space between them. For a while, neither of them spoke. The boy stared at the ground, his mind racing with everything he wanted to say but couldn't find the words for. The girl stared at her hands, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't care what they said in there," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't care about that stupid test. It doesn't change anything." The girl turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "How can you say that? Everything we thought we knew, it's gone. They took it away from us." "They didn't take anything," he said, his voice growing firmer. "They can say whatever they want, but they don't know us. They don't know what we've been through." The girl shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But what if they're right? What if we're not really family?" The boy sat up straight, turning to face her fully. "You listen to me," he said, his voice steady now. "We've been through everything together. We've taken care of each other when no one else would. That's what makes us family, not some dumb piece of paper." The girl sniffled, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "But what if?" "No," he interrupted, his tone resolute. "I don't care what the paper says. You'll always be my sister. Always." The girl's lips trembled as she tried to hold back another wave of tears. "Do you really mean that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yeah, I do. You're my sister. Nothing will ever change that." For a moment, the girl just stared at him, her chest rising and falling with shaky breaths. Then, with a sob, she threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered through her tears. "Thank you." The boy wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly. For the first time all day, he felt a sense of relief, a sense of purpose. They might not have had all the answers, and the world might never see them the way they saw each other, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the bond they had chosen to keep, the family they had built with their own hands and hearts. When they finally pulled apart, the girl wiped her eyes and managed a small, shaky smile. "So, what do we do now?" The boy smirked, a glimmer of his old self returning. "We keep going. Like we always do. Together." The girl nodded, her smile growing a little stronger. Together. They stood and began walking down the street, side by side, their steps lighter than before. The world around them hadn't changed, it was still cruel, still unjust, but they knew now that their bond was stronger than anything the world could throw at them. What do you think of this story? Let us know your thoughts below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more incredible stories like this one. Your support means everything to us.